Hello everybody, I'm Elizabeth Whittome and I'm going to talk to you today about teaching a poem. Now, I'm not going to tell you at the beginning who wrote the poem or when, because what I want to do is concentrate on the words of the poem, because I think all too often we get hung up on context and we talk about historical matters or background or the biography of the poet, and we don't spend enough time looking at the words of the poem. Now, the poem is not a long one, and I think it's fairly straightforward in terms of meanings. I don't think you'll find that your students would think it was difficult. But let me give you the poem first. Let me read it to you, and then we'll talk about it. Here we go. Never of us be said we had no war to wage, because our womanhood, because our weight of age held us in servitude. None sees us fight, but we in the long night battle to give release to all whom we must send to seek and die for peace. When they are gone, we in a twilit place meet terror face to face and strive with him that we might keep our fortitude alive. Theirs be the hard, but ours the lonely bed. Naught were we spared, of us this word must not be said. Now, this is a poem which straight away, I think, is interesting because it's not an I poem. It's not I did this or I felt that, or a nature poem, I looked at the trees or the trees were there without the I there. It's a poem about we, never of us be said. So it's a poem which speaks for more than one person. We can see that straight away. We've got we, we've got us. Right at the end of the poem, the poet says, "Naught were we spared, of us this word shall not be said." So the word that she's talking about is spared. And she feels strongly about the fact that the word spared has been used of the we, of the us, who have no war to wage. She feels they have not been spared and that word should not be said. So I feel this is a poem where to emphasize the words from the very beginning is very appropriate. The first word perhaps that might strike you, which is part of a pattern of words. You're always looking for patterns in poetry. You're looking for repetitions. You're looking for words which seem to belong to the same semantic field, so that you can say to your students, well, actually, these words belong together. Why has the poet used those words? What effect do they have? The very first word in the poem takes us into an interesting semantic field. In other words, a group of words which have similar meanings. And they're very effective here. Never of us be said, these words. Never. Then we have none sees us fight. None, which means no one. And then right at the end of the poem, in the last line, we have naught were we spared. Naught means nothing. Actually, slightly old-fashioned word, and there are some words in the poem that you might feel are slightly old-fashioned, and they might start to give you a clue as to when it was written. But for the moment, you've got these powerful negatives which shape the structure of the poem. We've got never, we've got none, we've got naught. So that is, I think, very effective. We have a sense of somebody who feels strongly that something has been said and she's arguing against it. We know, or the persona is a woman because she talks about our womanhood. Another semantic field which strikes you when you look at this poem, and one which your students will be able to pick out, I think, quite easily, is that the poet is saying she has no war to wage, and she uses the words of battle in the poem. So there is no war to wage, but none sees us fight. So she's saying we fight and we battle to give release to those who we must send to seek and die for peace. And then later on, we meet terror face to face and strive with him. So we've got fight, battle and strive. All of those are words connected with battle. So that's very effective. The idea that women are fighting and suffering is helped by, first of all, those negative words which deny the fact that they're just living an easy life at home. We've looked at those. And then using the words of battle to show that the women are fighting in their own way. So the point of view of the poem is of women. We have the word womanhood. Women are the we and the us of the poem. They do have a war to wage. They are being separated from men. They are being focused upon in this poem. And the language supports that. And your looking at the language will support the importance of women in the poem. Womanhood is, of course, an abstract noun. It's the state of being a woman. And this poet uses other abstract nouns as well. She uses the word servitude. She says, our womanhood and the weight of age held us in servitude. It suggests that women are inferiors. They're like servants. So we're talking about a time for the poem when women were not considered to be equal to men, and the word servitude suggests that quite strongly. They're like servants, either because they're just women or because they're old and therefore they don't count. The weight of age held us in servitude. We also have another abstract noun, which is fortitude. That you have to strive with terror because you have to save your fortitude. Now that's an interesting word. Fortitude, a slightly old-fashioned word. It means strength, your strength. Actually, it's another war kind of word, really. The men have got to show fortitude, but the women have got to keep their fortitude alive, because if they don't, then terror will overcome them. So those abstract nouns are used very interestingly, I think, in the poem to suggest the women themselves and the qualities they have, but also the kind of responsibility that they've got to remain strong in their own right. And I think that section where the speaker of the poem talks about facing terror, and when the combatants are gone and they are in a twilit place, they meet terror face to face and strive with him. It's one of the few figures of speech in the poem. It's not a poem filled with metaphors and similes at all, but the personification of terror, and the word terror is capitalized as well. Terror is a figure, a male figure. And you have to strive with terror. You've got to overcome terror. Otherwise, how could you manage? How could you manage at home if you can't manage to overcome your fear? So terror is personified very effectively, I think. The other rather interesting figure of speech, I think, is in the last section, and that is, theirs be the hard, but ours the lonely bed. The idea that the bed is lonely is actually a figure of speech known as metonymy. It's where one thing substitutes for another that is closely related to it. The women are lonely, not the bed, but their lonely bed reminds us that they are alone at night and that they feel lonely. Just as for the soldiers they're talking about, theirs be the hard bed, theirs be the hard, but ours the lonely bed. Obviously for the soldiers, their bed probably is hard, actually, in the trenches. But for the women, theirs is lonely. It's the loneliness of it all. Now, this is a poem, and one of the things I think which is always a helpful thing to do with a poem when you're teaching it is to say to students, why don't you write this in prose? See what it sounds like, and you'll find that you've lost the magic completely if you do that. Let's just take that first very powerful stanza. Never of us be said we had no war to wage, because our womanhood, because the weight of age held us in servitude. Now, if you put that into slightly more modern idiom, don't ever say we don't have any war to wage, because we're women, because we're old, and we're considered to be an inferior breed. It just doesn't have the same effect, does it? One of the reasons for that is that, of course, that is rhythmical in a way which many poems are, and the rest of the poem is as well. But never of us be said we had no war to wage, because our womanhood, because the weight of age held us in servitude. I've exaggerated it so that you can hear that it has quite a regular rhythm. The rhymes, though, we have two full rhymes with wage and age, but said, hood, and tude are not full rhymes, they're half rhymes. And although they bind that stanza together, they create an atmosphere of uneasiness. Actually, that settles, and we get into then, in the rest of the poem, some full rhymes. We have fight, night, release, peace, place, face, strive, alive, bed, and said through the rest of the poem. So there is rhyme there. Don't forget, remind students that you can't say too much about rhyme because it's quite difficult to make it sound sensible, especially if they're writing about it. But if they just bear in mind that rhyme binds the words together in meaning as well as in sound. But it is a rhythmical poem, and the lines are generally of much the same length. However, there are two which stand out as different, and it's useful for your students to notice this, I think. The first one is a long line, which is, to all whom we must send to seek and die for peace. Now, there's quite a lot of meaning in that line, because it suggests that, although the women are not thought of highly, nonetheless, they are in the position to persuade men to go off to seek and die for peace. All whom we must send to seek and die for peace. So they do have quite an important function in that. It's a kind of patriotic function, perhaps, if the men are going off to fight for their country. The other line, which doesn't fit into the normal pattern of lines in the poem, is and strive. This is in that very evocative stanza about meeting terror face to face. And it's very dramatic because it goes, when they are gone, we in a twilit place meet terror face to face and strive with him that we may save our fortitude alive. So strive there is very short and very dramatic. If this were in a play, the lines being spoken by a character, there would be a pause. It's like in a Shakespeare play where the line is very short because there's actually intended to be a long pause where these other beats are imagined before the next words come in. So I find that very effective. It's very dramatic. It's a poem which you can see is about women not going to war and feeling that they suffer in their own way just as much at home, but it's a different kind of way from the soldiers who have to go. And I feel that it really, in a most dramatic and evocative way, conjures up what women must have felt. It's a poem of the First World War, and you may have guessed that. There is something slightly old-fashioned about some of the words, and That's fine. We don't expect somebody writing in the 1418 war to use exactly the same language that we would use today. But it is interesting to note that we always associate the First World War with poets who your students will have heard of, people like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Isaac Rosenberg, etc. But actually, a quarter of the First World War poems were written by women, whereas only a fifth of the First World War poems were actually written by soldiers, by combatants. Isn't that interesting? I found that really interesting when I found that out, fairly recently actually, and it's part of a whole sense that the women were not as important. That's not to deny the fact that a poet like Wilfred Owen or Robert Graves or Siegfried Sassoon, these are wonderful poets. I'm not denying that at all. But I think this poem has got a lot to offer. And it puts a completely different point of view. And that's really important, I think, for students to think about. By concentrating on the words of the poem, we've actually got into the feelings of the persona, the person who is speaking the poem, if you like, the we, the us, and got a sense of the feeling behind it. Now, one of the things that students find difficult to talk about and write about is tone in a poem. When I read the poem at the beginning, I read it in quite an angry way. Naught were we spared, of us this word shall not be said. And that is very angry, hostile to the person. Somebody has perhaps said, well, you women were spared. No, we weren't spared. You can't use that word of us. Of us this word shall not be said. So the poem can be expressed in a very angry tone and seen in that way. But actually there are elements in the poem which are not quite so strident. I think those are centred on the areas where the speaker of the poem is imagining that it's night time. At night time is when they have to battle to let their men go. That's when we in the long night battle to give release to those whom we must send to seek and die for peace. We've got to send them, but we're battling to do that in the long night. And then that image of night is picked up a bit later. We in a twilight place, on their own, getting dark, that's when they feel terror. And she feels it so strongly that they meet terror face to face. And it strikes me that that is a really different part of the poem tonally. You could express that with real anguish and fear, meeting terror face to face, at home alone. How do they feel? Worrying, terrified that their men are going to be killed. And of course, so many of them were. But you've got to overcome that. You've got to strive with terror and try and save your fortitude. You've got to try and keep your strength going. So very, very interesting changes of tone. You could express that more wistfully, more sadly. You could go for that side of it, or more angrily, passionate, sort of vehement expression of the poem. So very, very interesting, I think, a very dramatic sort of poem. The poet is a woman called Evelyn Underhill, who, a very interesting writer. I recommend that, having discussed the poem, you get your students to go and look her up, and you'll find that she was primarily a religious writer. She was not a poet. But this was something that she did write. She did write some poems, but they were often of a religious nature. This is not, I think, particularly religious. This is very much focused on the feelings of women at home. The word fortitude is an interesting one, though, because that suggests that you've got to keep your strength up in a kind of dutiful way. But she was, in fact, in her 40s when she wrote this, in the middle of the war. So she was a woman who was somewhere between a woman sending off her husband or a woman sending off her son. So she was able to sympathise with both sides, I think. in this particular case. I bet you would have guessed that this was a First World War poem, but actually it could apply to many wars where women felt that they had to send their men off and that perhaps they were accused of having the soft option, remaining at home. And I don't think that was the soft option. The soldier's bed was hard, but theirs was lonely.